And it is my distinct privilege to welcome you here tonight, and especially to introduce a man and his wife, people that need no introduction in this place. They're the celebrities of the island. And really, when I was thinking about tonight, I couldn't help but to think about Pete Edison in a generation gone by. It was said of Pete Edison as Pete was getting later in life that Pete represented man on Isle Royal. And I think Pete represented the best of man on Isle Royal, the fit and Nordic. There is an eternal nature to Rolf. There was an eternal nature to Pete Edison. There is that peace that I think comes through living in this place. And so tonight, I know it will be the joy of all of us in this room to soak in what Rolf and Candy have to share with us. And it'll leave us changed too. So without further ado, I welcome you, Rolf, tonight.
So Candy is back in the stacks out here. Hey, come on, wave your hand. Go down as a major one in Isle Royal history because of what the National Park Service did in terms of its wolf population. So I thought I'd review tonight maybe some of the reasons why the Park Service went to this major step of intervention and putting wolves back, essentially restarting the whole population. And so it'll be about the importance of wolves here on this island. And I should acknowledge the co-principal investigator, John Brustich, and then another generation removed, Sarah Hoy, who's a lot younger than both of us, and can do stuff on the computer. Just about a year ago, in June 2018, up at the highest level in the Department of the Interior, there was a record of decision signed which allowed the National Park Service to move ahead with its implementation plan, or to develop an implementation plan, actually, to restore wolf predation to Isle Royal. And this followed a 3-year environmental impact study, which elicited public comments several times, and thousands of people expressed their opinion. And actually, I want to be sure to acknowledge the public opinion, because it's, I think, probably what really swayed the whole process. The public opinion that was recorded was overwhelmingly in support of maintaining wolves on Isle Royal. Whether they went to extinction or not, 85 to 90% of people said Isle Royal needs wolves. And it was pretty hard to ignore those numbers in any case. And in the end, June, the papers were signed, and I thought, well, here we go again, it'll be another 4 years. But within 4 months, the Park Service had new wolves on the ground here, and they moved with incredible speed, and they've continued to move with speed through the entire winter. So amazing that an awful lot was done in a very short amount of time. So the first 2 wolves that came in from the Grand Portage reservation in northeastern Minnesota arrived in late September, and they just kind of walked out of the cage and hit the dirt. Well, it took many hours actually for them to leave the cage. So they usually did it at night when nobody was watching and all the photographers had gone to bed. But I think number 1 did come out during the day. And this was number 2. Let's see. Number 2 is a really nice looking wolf, very handsome female, and she's no longer on Isle Royal. For reasons that I don't understand at all, she decided she wanted out of here. And as soon as the ice froze even a little bit in late January, she was gone. She's still alive, and she found that I think she likes highways, because things die on highways, and so far it hasn't been her. So I don't know what she's looking for, but she's still roaming around, and but she didn't find Isle Royale to be her cup of tea at all. So they came in a variety of ways: airplanes, boats, just an enormous logistical challenge. So they all came in these little metal cages, and there was moose provided for them, which they ate, and then they started walking around. All of these new wolves have very fancy radio collars they're GPS collars that send out a location every 6 hours, and it gets uploaded to a satellite and downloaded to computers, and so in theory you kind of know where they are with a day or two lag. This was a male who also didn't make it. He was, I think, number 3 to come in early October, and had a fine bill of health. But a month later, he was dead, and his body was sent to one of either the federal or the state pathology labs, and he had fluid in his lungs, evidently pneumonia of some sort. He had not lost any weight at all, and I'm of the opinion it was probably some sort of stress. He was plucked out of his home and put on an island, and even with abundant food, not every wolf's going to make it, even with that situation. So it was a surprise to me, because I tend to think of wolves as being very resilient, but the ones that have formed my opinion are those that just take off from home. They're the pioneers, and they always do well. It's the stay-at-homes, the homebodies that really don't want to leave, because of all the new wolves brought in, and moose have continued to climb to over 2,000. So wolves haven't had any impact on the moose at all, and they probably, well, I'm not even sure it will be noticeable within a year, because the moose population has got such a huge momentum going, but we'll see. There we go. The problem for wolves, the reason why the wolf population dwindled to near zero was the lack of ice, and the lack of ice has been slowly building for the last 60 years, actually for the last 100 years, because in the 1880s, 1890s, the U.S. mail used to get run across the ice by horses and dogs, and it was just like an ice road. It was just a continuation of the land for months at a time. By the 1920s, things started to change, and actually the long-term temperature records at Thunder Bay showed about a 2-degree rise in annual temperature in the 20s. And then it got warmer and warmer. The 60s to the present day, the major change has been in winter temperature, and also wind. There's a lot more wind now than there used to be, and it's hard to get measurements on that, but we fly a little airplane. The pilots call them paper airplanes because they're made out of canvas and fabric and wood, and so we're limited by the wind speed. So if it's more than 15 miles an hour, we aren't able to fly. So we fly a lot less now than we used to, say, 30 years ago. So because of the wind, especially in warmer temperatures, these ice bridges just don't form the way they used to, and wolves don't have the avenue to get here to Isle Royale that they used to have. What's kept the wolf population going for 70 years or so are the very rare new immigrants that come in and stay to reproduce. And there have been at least 2 of those, and that's kept the population going in spite of inbreeding potential. There's a ridiculously small number of breeding wolves here, and no way that they should be able to keep it going without any new incoming genes or wolves. Moose have been rolling along for the past almost 120 years. Probably arrived early in the 1900s. We don't know exactly how they got here, but by the 20s there were moose everywhere. And by 1930 there were probably 3,000 or more moose. Nobody's too sure because it wasn't possible to count them back then. There was a massive die-off in 1934, and then gradually the moose built up again. So by 1944, in the middle of World War II actually, there was correspondence going on between the director of the National Park Service and some of the prominent conservationists in North America, Aldo Leopold prominently, to think about putting wolves on Iowa World to control this moose population. For one reason or another, that was not done very soon. Leopold died in a grass fire in 1948, never made it to Isle Royal. And by 1952, there was a private effort from a Detroit newspaperman named Lee Smits to put wolves on Isle Royal, and he funded it himself. The Park Service said, all right, go ahead. And he couldn't find any wolves. And he had a reward out for wild wolves in Michigan. Nobody took him up on it. So he had his own wolf named Jim. And he donated to the Detroit Zoo when Jim became not such a great house guest anymore. And then there were a couple other, three other wolves in the Detroit Zoo. So they used zoo wolves. Brought Jim out and Queenie and a couple others and released them in 1952 in August. And in 3 weeks they just created chaos. Showed up at Rock Harbor, scared people to death. They put them down at the Edison fishery. And Laura, who's Pete Edison's wife, said, you know, they just tore up her laundry and they just were a real pain. One was shot, dumped in the lake. One was shot at, and nobody knows what happened to her. One was trapped and put back in the Detroit Zoo, and Big Jim was never seen again. So that was the end of that experiment in 3 weeks. But there were already wild wolves on the island by then, and it was just so hard to document their presence, and there were coyotes everywhere. So getting track counts and everything was hard, but those wild wolves took hold, and by the late 1950s, Derwent Allen at Purdue University, who was my major professor, started this 10-year ambitious study to figure out what wolves do with an unregulated moose population, where neither wolf or moose is hunted. So the moose are the prey, of course, and they came under new management in the 50s when these wolves showed up. And since that time, wolves have been molding this moose population in ways that have proved to be very fascinating. So the 10-year study became a 12-year study when I started, and now it's a 62-year study. So it continues to be very interesting. By the way, this is a yearling bull moose. They're born, of course, in mid-May, and they're with their mother for a whole year, totally dependent on mom, and then come the next year in May, if she's going to have another calf, she literally kicks this one out of the house. I mean, kicking and, yeah, very violent. So they're very disoriented and disturbed, and they seek companionship, which could be you. So this bull is looking at me, and then he would trot a few steps towards me, and it's very unnerving, but they will stop at some point. At least they always have. When they realize, oh, this is not my mother, and then they'll trot away, and then they'll think it over, and then they come trotting back, and it's very strange. But these year-old moose also become very easy for wolves to deal with. In addition to killing lots of calves, yearlings are also vulnerable. But other than that, pretty much moose are unable to be killed by wolves until they're 9 or 10 or 11 or 12. And they have a variety of problems like arthritis, bad teeth, and so forth. And that makes them possible for wolves to kill. Oh, geez, an awful lot of graph here. The point of this is that when you add predators to a system, you end up with fewer prey. So you can add wolves, you end up with reduced prey. You can add bears, further reduced prey. You can add cougars, they go on even further. So Isle Royal, I won't put this up for any longer. Isle Royal is unique in that it only has one carnivore, the wolf. If there were bears here, moose would probably exist at a much lower level, if at all. I mean, we don't know the answer to that. So Isle Royal is unique in that it has just wolves. Nowhere else in the world are there moose that have wolves without bears. So the answer we get here is a little cleaner than other places where there's both bears and wolves feeding on moose. So the effects of wolves on this system boil down to the vegetation. Because wolves do reduce moose density, they moderate what happens to the vegetation because moose are eating the vegetation. Moose are strict vegans. They're very fussy eaters, and they show preferences, diet preferences that we just barely understand. So, but we do know that they eat balsam fir. It's their primary winter food. If you look out here, probably half the trees you see are balsam fir. And the east end balsam fir are completely different than the west end balsam fir. And I'll show you what the difference is. And then aquatic resources, there's been a very interesting plant called water shield, which has kind of been our indicator of how moose are treating aquatic systems. So I'll use those two examples to look at what it means when moose population, which had been reduced pretty low in the early 2000s to about 1 per square kilometer, about 500 moose, when it increased to about 1,500 by 2012 to 2017. And now, of course, it's more than 2,000. Oh yes, and then beaver are the other primary prey of wolves, and beaver had been counted annually, just the active colonies, had been counted by airplane from 2006 to 2010, and during that time beaver were just barely hanging on. So wolves were really hammering them hard, and there was about a 50% turnover in active beaver lodges every year. So I think a new beaver pair got going and just barely got going, and then wolves snuffed them out again. So this was a situation where wolves were having a huge impact on beaver because beaver had pretty much eaten all the available trees within range of their pond. And then when the wolf population crashed in essentially 2012, there was a noticeable increase in beaver. And we said, wow, that's neat. And then it went up again, then it went up again, and now it's just way out of sight. So beavers are walking twice as far as they used to cut a tree. So that opened up a huge area of untouched aspen, which is the beaver's favorite food. And if any of you have walked to Lane Cove, there's just aspen trees laid over every which way. You know, huge things like this that beavers have cut, and they're extremely busy at cutting their favorite tree and damming everything up. And so if you hike out of Daisy Farm on any trail, particularly up to the Greenstone, you'll be walking through wetlands that were created by beaver. So beaver are a major source of food for wolves, and not having wolves meant beavers all over the place. So this is what west end balsam fir looks like. This is about 3 feet tall. Trees are 40, 50, 60 years old. They've just never gotten away from moose. And they just look like little sticks. So if you're a 1,000-pound moose, imagine trying to get by eating that stuff. But if you're a 50-year-old tree that looks like that, imagine how you feel when you see a moose coming. And actually, we've got a biochemist that's working with us now that points out that within seconds of an herbivore eating a balsam fir tree, the tree itself is generating new genes, activating new genes to try and generate new chemicals to try to save it And balsam fir, all that nice Christmassy smell, that's just toxic terpenes that are there because they tend to deter herbivores from eating them. And the chemistry is so complicated that I've only found 2 biochemists in my whole career that were willing to tackle it. And they have very interesting stories. The best one is, for one thing, these biochemists can sniff individual terpene chemicals. That's very impressive to me. But we found that old moose that are marginal, nutritionally marginal, seem to have a preference for one terpene called myrcene, which in human medicine is an anti-inflammatory that's useful in arthritis research. So there's a possibility here, very speculative, that moose are actually self-medicating. Yeah, well, wait till the media get that one. Okay, and at the west end, because moose have been feeding on it for 100 years and not letting any trees come up except spruce, which they don't eat, all these black areas are becoming these moose savannas where it's just really spruce trees and then exotic grasses that come in. So botanists call this the canopy breakup phase, which has been going on for a long, long time, very slowly, so slowly that I didn't even appreciate that it was happening. But in the Canadian Maritimes, this whole sequence happened in about 10 years because spruce budworm came in and killed the canopy outright, and then it just never grew back. So there's thousands of hectares of many of the national parks on the Canadian coast where there are no wolves, there are no bears, and there's lots of moose, where the forest is gone, and they're encouraging little kids to carry bags of trees out and planting them. It's just pathetic. There's no option to put wolves there yet. So they've resorted to shooting moose, which is an idea that people continually bring up for a while. People in Iowa will just shoot moose. Well, it's a huge sink for money, first of all. And the problem is you can't get hunters moved around, even with roads, and then you can't get the meat out. So the Park Service initially put that up on their idea board, and it quickly dropped off, especially because public reaction was so negative. But anyway, at the west end, this is the understory of struggling balsam fir. But then in the 2000s, something really amazing happened, and that is these trees started to grow because they weren't being eaten by moose, because wolf predation had risen to an extremely high level, because we'd had one new immigrant come in 1997, and his genes spread through the whole population, and they began killing moose at a rate twice as high as we'd ever seen. So after 50 years, things were appearing that were major changes that we never even anticipated were possible. So right now, the major scientific question is, okay, we restarted the wolf population. Is it going to be just a return to the way it used to be? I would guess probably not. And I don't know what the possibilities are. But we know that there have been major changes, major historical events that have long, long legacies. The arrival of canine parvovirus back in 1980 or so, which killed most of the wolves. We're still living in the shadow of that today. The arrival of that immigrant male in 1997, definitely we're still in his shadow genetically. So what a brand new wolf population will mean is, anybody's guess at the moment. Anyway, these nice recovering trees, which we had great hopes for, as recently as 3 years ago, have fallen on hard times these last couple of years. They started growing, and then some of them started being browsed, but in the last 2 years, all of them are browsed, and then moose are taking to just breaking them off about this high. And moose can break off a tree the size of my arm, and then they just walk away. They don't even eat the thing. I don't know why. But so this great hope that we had for balsam fir is pretty much gone by the wayside. So wolves are coming in a little bit late to really save these forests. But we'll see. So that's the terrestrial story. So the jury is still out on whether balsam fir will make it or not. And if it doesn't make it, and the forest basically dwindles at the west end, what does that mean for the moose population? That'll take decades to resolve itself. The aquatic systems, things happen a lot faster. I guess primarily because moose are huge, prodigious aquatic feeders. In fact, the reason for their long nose, which is quite unique in the deer family, is to have lots of fancy ligaments and tendons which allow them to close their nostrils when they're underwater. You can't do that. Just try it sometime. The privacy of your own tub. Doesn't work. But a moose can do that. So they're very well adapted to feeding on the plants in aquatic systems. And this is a particularly interesting plant. It's called water shield. And it's a floating pondweed kind of thing. Very nutritious, very high in protein, and it just takes over a pond very, very readily. And this started to happen in 2006, and we hardly even noticed this plant before, but by 2010, it completely covered several ponds at this east end, including Lake Ojibwe, which is just behind Daisy Farm. And the moose didn't take them long to discover this plant, and they were attracted to all these 5 areas, these 5 ponds where water shield was in great numbers. I should point out that aquatic plants have sodium in them, and sodium is an absolutely required element. Moose need it, you need it, and we don't have any trouble finding sodium because we're inundated with sodium because we have a taste for it that's exploited by the food industry. But in this part of the continent, there's not a lot of sodium in the rocks, and moose have to go to great lengths to find it. And they have 2 sources. One are mineral licks, natural springs that are high in sodium, probably because of some sedimentary rock the glaciers dumped underground 10,000 years ago, or else it's aquatic plants. So moose were accumulating in impressive numbers, 3 to 4 years ago, and pretty much eating everything they could. We've filmed moose on the bottom of ponds, and they have their eyes open. They don't blow any bubbles because they have huge lung capacity, and they eat just about everything they can find down there on the bottom of the pond. So they're not too selective. And after 7, 8 years of this, this is what Lake Ojibwe, the water looked like near shore. A little bit like some kind of a sewage lagoon in some faraway country. Looked pretty bad. And moose were just trampling the lake shores. And yeah, that seemed like a pretty major effect, but it was nothing compared to what was going to happen to Lake Ojibwe. This is where we just measured water shield, and then the decline in water shield over a 3-year period down to the point where moose ate it all. Beaver also eat water shield, but they're not nearly as good at it as moose that accumulate from many, many miles away. So moose eat about 10 times the amount of water shield and other plants than beaver do. So, in November 2017, the beaver dam broke that holds back Lake Ojibwe, and the lake drained, and it just left this big mud flat, which was a huge surprise to us last June or May when we showed up. And it was an even bigger surprise to the literally hundreds of moose that showed up to do what they've been doing their whole life, which was eat all that stuff on the bottom. So they'd walk to the lake shore and they'd look out at that mud flat. And if you've seen moose, you know they take a long time to make decisions. And they'd look away, and then they'd look back at that mud flat. And after 10 minutes or so, sometimes they'd walk out onto the mud, and then they'd change their mind and just walk away. And then he'd come back the next day and see if it was still that way. So this was a huge change for the lake. It was a temporary boon for wolves because all these beavers were left high and dry and their lodges were completely exposed. So I had a trail camera set up, and let's see, I think we'll be able to get this working. It's a two 60-second clips taken by an automatic camera, and this shows there's 2 wolves that are native to Isle Royale that are still out there. The male is, this guy is 11 years old now, and his daughter and mate and sister 9 years old. So I'll try and get this video to work, and then what it shows is this wolf with a very, very full stomach. He's carrying a baby beaver in his mouth because he can't get it into his stomach, and then he scent marks this this patch of vegetation and goes on. And this had happened just after the beaver dam broke, so he's dining high in the hog. Let's see.
What caused the dam to break?
What caused the dam to break? Poor maintenance by beavers. And that's hard to imagine.
There he goes.
There he goes.
Oh, he's very fast.
So that's a classic RLU known in the literature as a raised leg urination. And then 4 minutes later, the female came by. She did not have a beaver in her mouth, but she had an equally full stomach. And she marked the same bush in what's known as an SQU, squat urination. I'm sure wolves would be amused to read the literature. Oops. Oh, I didn't show you her.
No, not yet.
No.
There he is again.
Well, how about me too? No. I didn't show you the female. But here she is. This is her. And this is him just last winter. There's a sort of familiar resemblance. And they still own the eastern half of Isle Royale, and they're not given an inch, and they're still hanging on to each other. So, yeah, I'm not sure what will happen when one of them dies, as it inevitably will. But everybody, these 2 wolves realize there's other wolves on Isle Royale, and everybody that's new to Isle Royale knows that these 2 own the east half of Isle Royale. So, and I don't know if they've come face to face or if they just know it through scent marking and howling. But this winter, oh yeah, every year the male, 3rd week of February is the mating season for wolves. This happens once a year. And the male, because his daughter is the only female on the island for the last several years, tries to interest his daughter in mating. And they did mate once in 2014, and they had one pup who survived till about 9 months of age, and he was physically deformed. I mean, his tail went around like a big question mark, and his back was hunched up, and probably he was dead before he was a year old. He or she, I'm not sure. So ever since then, she has totally refused to get interested in mating with her father. Pretty clear, even to us in an airplane. So that's the end of reproduction for Isle Royale native wolves. But this year, about the 20th of February, these 2 wolves were over at Lane Cove, and they were really interested in some tracks on the ground, which were not theirs, wolf tracks. So we actually landed the plane to figure out, which way are these tracks going, how many are there. So that's a urine mark by a foreign wolf. And there were 3 tracks of 3 wolves that we followed all the way from Todd Harbor on the north side, around the whole west end, down along the south shore of Houghton Point, and then they disappeared out on the frozen Siskiyou Bay. So for the next 3-4 days, this pair did nothing but track these wolves, these foreign wolves, scent mark over everything they could, and they were very keen on the whole thing. I don't know what they were gonna do if they run into those 3 wolves, but they never did. But this is evidence that they're hanging on pretty tight to their territory. Meanwhile, there's only 2 other wolves on Isle Royal during the month of February. 2 females that came from the Grand Portage area in Minnesota, not necessarily related. And they stationed themselves on prominent points at the west end and just sat there. They'd kill moose when they needed to, and then they just lollygag around on a ridge every day. And I couldn't help but think they're waiting for a male to come by. And they never did. No male ever came by. So this moose, or this wolf had a kill that it sat on for literally 2 weeks. And this one was the last of the wolves to be brought in last October. And there was some debate about whether they should even bring her in because she only weighed 52 pounds. It's a little on the young side. And they thought, well, this is going to be it for the year. We better just bring her to Isle Royal. And so she began killing moose calves pretty readily by January. So in 5 weeks, she killed 4 moose calves by herself. And this is about maximum stomach capacity for a wolf. So yeah, probably half her body weight is in her stomach. And so these 2 went through the breeding season by themselves, sitting on these rocky points, and then just gave up, I think, got together, and this is where female 4 sat, and this is where female 1 sat, and then on the 1st of March, they got together on a new kill, and then they traveled together right up through the east end of Isle Royal, like, well, I don't know what they're doing, they're exploring. And so as luck would have it, when the new wolves, 4 new wolves came in on the 3rd of March, they're sitting up here at Lake Point, and the new wolves are all dumped off down here.
Oh, no.
I don't know if that's important or not. Oh, this is, you know, the little dots are half-hour locations of these moose that get beamed up to a satellite and then downloaded to the computer. So the 10 moose at the east end in the 3rd week of April were spread around like this, and then 2 of them started moving, you know, just as the snow was melting. And this moose, last night, well, she went in April and early May down Hatchet Lake, but last night, after starting traveling again last weekend, she was walking into Wendigo. So I was very surprised to see this major migration by some of these individuals. Okay, enough of those dots. Oh, but now I got one major map with lots of dots. Okay. This is like 75,000 locations of collared moose in the last 4 months. So they've obviously made pretty thorough use of the entire east end. This is all one moose that went down here at Wood Lake and then came back up. This is, you know, obviously you can spend all night looking at these tracings. And you can make some sense out of some of them. Right now in the middle of May, middle of June, all the moose are either going to mineral licks where they can get sodium, or they're going to ponds where they can eat aquatic plants. So they feel this strong sodium hunger, especially right now. So going to ponds is a good idea if you want to see a moose. So end of February, early March, 3 wolves were brought in. Oh, wait a minute, pardon me. No, this is the whole mess. From October through March, 4 wolves were brought from Minnesota, 3 from mainland Ontario, all black wolves, and then 8 wolves, 1 whole pack from Michipicoten Island, which is right here. And that's a very interesting story. Michipicoten Island's about a third the size of Isle Royal. It was intended to be a refuge for caribou, a predator-free refuge for caribou. And then about 4 years ago, 3 wolves found their way over the ice to Michipicoten Island and started dining on caribou pretty liberally. And so the population of several hundred caribou were reduced to maybe a dozen or so by January 2018, a year and a half ago. And at that point, the Ontario government, since caribou have a pretty precarious status in the Lake Superior region, like this is it, picked up as many caribou as they could find using helicopter net guns and moved 11 animals to Slate Island up there, and then they moved 6 more down to here, and then they couldn't find any more caribou. And the last caribou was seen on Michipicoten in June, a year ago right now. So then the wolves fed on beaver all summer and did okay, and then the beavers go under the ice in November and the wolves started to starve. And the Ontario government gave them anything they could find, a lot of meat, chickens, kibble dog food, beaver carcasses, and kept them alive till they hoped the National Park Service could use them in January. But then the government shut down in January, and everything was put on ice, and the weather was uncooperative, and so, it just never happened in January. A little window opened up in late February, and then 4 wolves were brought through from Wawa and through from Michipicoten. And then we all figured, well, that's it. And then, but the superintendent was just stubborn on this whole point. And as a result of her just pushing, 7 or 8 more were brought in at the end of March, all from Michipicoten, plus 1 more from Wawa. So 3 of them were black, and I was really hoping for some black wolves because they have there's one gene that determines coat color, black or gray, and it's a gene that, this is coming from research at Yellowstone, it's called the K locus. It's originated from dogs here in North America, Native American dogs. There are no black wolves in Asia and Europe, but this black gene was picked up by dogs breeding with wolves here in North America. And it's maintained because it may have some immune system benefits, particularly if you've got mange. So anyway, plus they're just a lot easier to distinguish than the sea of gray wolves. And know that black wolf is a certain individual. So I was really happy to see black wolves come in. This is a young female from near the Wawa airport who was taken off of a moose kill, so she knows how to kill moose. And so does her associate, a big black male who unfortunately died in early April of undetermined causes. So there's 2 black wolves left now. And then, that's another shot of her. She's got big earrings, all kinds of stuff on her. And then the Michipicoten wolves, this was the alpha male in that, the breeding male in that Michipicoten population who came over from mainland Ontario and colonized the island. And 3 years ago, it was either him or his associate, another male, were captured and collared, and he weighed 140 pounds. Now that's bigger than any wolf weighed in North America in the last century. So I had great hopes to get him on Isle Royal. So as a result of that late March effort, all 3 of the founders of Michipicoten Island wolf population are here on Isle Royal. Now when they came into Isle Royal, they weighed as little as 90 pounds, so they lost 50 pounds. And they were just skin and bones in very poor condition, but I hope they'll put on a lot of weight here and begin to do things that might surprise us all. Of course, there was more drama to this whole thing because the Park Service ran out of money just in the middle of this effort. So I was the proud first donor of a private effort to fund the rest of the story. And so I figure I own his right rear leg. And it's not uncommon with alpha males, particularly, they have an attitude about them. So whereas the Minnesota female had killed all these calves, we never saw her once in a month of almost daily flying. She would never sit on her own kill. She'd always hide back in the tree somewhere. Well, he hopped out of the helicopter, ran it immediately to one of this Minnesota female's kills and just sat on it. And then he ate his fill, and then he ran up to the east end of the island and just sat on Blake Point for many days, watching the ice floes go by, knowing that if he just could get on the ice, he could go home. And that never happened. But yeah, I think if there had been ice, we'd have lost a fair number of those newcomers. They have a strong homing instinct, and they don't care if there's unlimited food and no gunshots, no poison, no traps. They want to go where they're used to it. But he couldn't, so he's stuck. So anyway, after all is said and done, it was a very busy winter, and it calls to mind this quote by Tom Hobbs at Colorado State: "There's no quick fix once an apex predator is gone. Maintaining an intact ecosystem is so much easier, and I'll say much cheaper, than trying to restore it once the pieces have been lost." So with that, we got time for questions.